I'm Nadia, dietitian and certified intuitive eating counsellor, and welcome to Good Enough Nutrition, the podcast, a space where we chat all about nutrition and well-being, intuitive eating, body image, and a sprinkle of all things periods and hormones. I'm here to remind you that guilt has no place near our food or bodies, and that you are good enough as you are, always. So let's dig in. Hello, my cool cucumbers. Welcome back to Good Enough Nutrition, the podcast. In celebration of the launch of my online course, Nourish for Endometriosis, I wanted to dish you up a podcast that is all about nutrition for endometriosis. But not just any podcast summarizing nutrition for endo. There are so many good ones out there that talk about things like anti-inflammatory eating, the Mediterranean eating pattern, and the research. And they're wonderful, and that's all good stuff to know. But I didn't want to just say that all over again, because there are some great ones out there. So what I wanted to do instead is cover the nutrition related things that I feel that are missing from the conversation. So today I'm going to talk about the 4 key points that I'd love for you to know before you start to change your nutrition for endo. But before that, as always, I want to chat about what's been lighting me up recently. And I wanted to say that this online course that I'm releasing, it's been lighting me up on and off for almost a year. And that's one of the coolest things about working for myself and transitioning into my business almost full time, is that I've had the opportunity to do things like create an online course and create resources and fact sheets and play around with Canva, all the stuff that I wouldn't usually get to do if I was working for someone else. So that has been such a fun journey, and I never used to call myself a creative person, but I've come to realize that I actually am, and I really enjoy playing around with Canva and visuals and design, and it's been so much fun creating this course for you guys. And I think any of my clients would know that I am a sucker for a good fact sheet, so they probably won't be surprised when I say that I'm creative on that front. So what will you find inside the course? There are 4 modules. The first one is understanding endometriosis. The second is all about soothing your pain. The third is getting a happier gut. And the 4th is around reconnecting with our bodies. Now, the course, when you purchase it, you get access for 6 months. It's designed to be done over 3 to 6 months. So it's not something that's meant to be super intensive, super fast, like a 6 to 8 week program. It's something that's been designed to take slow and steady and hopefully make changes that are going to be sustainable and going to support your symptoms long term. I really wanted to make it long enough so that you felt like you don't have to rush and your nervous systems don't have to feel, urgent about doing it all at once. But I didn't want to make it so long that it just sits on your computer or on the app unused. So I felt that 6 months was about a good time frame. It's also self-paced because I know that everyone with endometriosis is at a different phase in their journey. Some people that I see are newly diagnosed, others have had their diagnosis for years, some are pre-surgery, post-surgery, not planning on getting surgery. So I just figured if it's self-paced, people can pick up wherever they want to when they feel like the time is right, because otherwise if I were to do it as a course that I go alongside with people, I know a lot of people would miss out because either they're not in the place to start at that point in time, or maybe they don't even have the finances to do so. And that was a really big decision for me in making sure that this course was affordable, because I know how expensive endometriosis can be. And I even found some interesting research that is from Australia and shows that the average cost per person is about $30,000 per year. And that just blows my mind. So by making it self-paced, it becomes more affordable. And to be honest, I think that the value is bonkers for what you're getting in the course. And like I said, you've got those 4 modules around pain and the gut and reconnecting with the body, but there's also some really cool bonus content like guided hypnosis recordings, and in the modules, some of my favorite content around things like the nervous system and body image. And maybe I'll have to do a podcast on each of these a day coming up, because they're just such fun things to talk about. One of the key reasons I created this course is because there's just so much confusing and conflicting and restrictive nutrition advice out there on the topic. So I really wanted a place for people to come where they can access evidence-based support without the fear that they're going to have to sacrifice their relationship with food or their brains doing all the research in the process. So there you have it. That's what's lighting me up at the moment. If you want to learn more about the course, I will pop a link in the show notes. But for now, let's jump over to the episode. Right, we're talking about nutrition for endometriosis, but we're talking about what is missing from the conversation. And I've got 4 key points that I want to cover. I did have 6, but I managed to cut it down to 4, but I could have done so many. Okay, so the first one is the foundations. Are you eating regularly and adequately? This is so often overlooked in the endometriosis spaces. People tend to jump straight to, talking about nutrients, things like turmeric or ginger or omega-3s, and that's all lovely stuff, but I can't overemphasize how important it is to have a foundation of eating regularly and eating enough. So why, you might ask, why do these, regular eating and adequate eating make up the foundation of eating for endo? Not eating enough and going for too long without eating is perceived as a threat to our safety by our body and by our nervous system. And I want to break down 2 things. What happens when we go for too long without eating, and then what happens when we're not eating enough longer term. So when you're going for long breaks between eating, your body senses that this is unsafe. The alarm bells go off, especially in terms of risk of your blood sugars going low. So what your body does is it initiates a stress response and sends you up into fight or flight. It mobilizes you. It gives you energy to say, go find food. Now, many people are familiar with the sensation of getting too hangry or irritable when they go for too long without eating. I am definitely familiar with that. And that is actually your body going into the fight response. But many people aren't aware that it can also send you into a flight response. And I see this really commonly when people haven't eaten for a while, it's getting towards lunchtime, they're at work and they're like, I've got so much work to do, I can't slow down, I'm too busy to stop for lunch. And some of that urgency is actually driven from our nervous system going into fight or flight. This is the flight in the fight or flight, right? Going into fight or flight because it has been so long since we last ate. So spending our days in fight or flight in this hyper-aroused state is not ideal at the best of times, but doing so when we have endometriosis is definitely not what we want. Because when we're in this hyper-aroused state from not eating regularly enough, we go what I call full meerkat. You can just picture a meerkat, on edge, watching out for the lion or the tiger, keeping lookout and being really kind of tense and tight and anxious. But what can happen is if we're in our kind of meerkat state, we actually become more sensitive to or start anticipating pain or gut symptoms. And in fact, if we're talking about gut symptoms, going into fight or flight can actually take us out of our rest and digest, making these gut symptoms worse. So being in a hyper-aroused state all the time, even if it's just, 2-3 times a day from going for too long without eating, can really make us less resilient to pain and more likely to notice or get gut symptoms. Secondly, If we're not eating enough long term, our body will choose to preserve our precious energy for our essential organs, like our heart and our lungs. And it does this by down-regulating our metabolism. So it downregulates our non-essential functions, things like thermoregulation, so we might feel cold all the time, brain function to an extent, so we might feel a bit of a brain fog or have trouble concentrating. It will downregulate our immune function, so we might get sick more often, as well as our gut function, so we get more of those gut symptoms. Now, of course, this is a spectrum, so you might not be experiencing those more major symptoms that I mentioned as a result of undernutrition. However, just slightly undereating in the longer term can lead to those things happening. And one of the other things that our body does is it forces us to think about food all the time if we're undereating, because it's wanting us to go find food. And with endo being an immune-related condition, let me tell you, the immune system is something that we want functioning at its optimal. So when we're getting this down regulation in immune function because we're not eating enough overall, once again, it's not putting us in that optimal position for managing our endometriosis. So eating enough food and eating regularly enough is the best place to start. It is the bedrock on which eating for endo is built, and it's something that I never hear spoken about. People just jump straight into talking about anti-inflammatory eating, but this really is the foundation. Now, in the past, eating regularly and eating enough may have been more simple, right? But now, thanks to things like intermittent fasting and ridiculous calorie restricted diets, it gets really confusing, and people that I talk to often don't know what eating regularly or eating enough looks like anymore. And of course, it's individualized based on the person that I have in front of me when I'm in the clinic. But as a general sense, I can give you a little overview of what eating regularly looks like. And what I use is a flexible rule of threes. That's 3 meals, 2 to 3 snacks, roughly every 3 hours. Now, like I said, this will be individualized. So if you're a late riser and you have, breakfast and after 3 or 4 hours, lunchtime rolls around, then that's fine. You probably won't need a morning tea. But if you're someone who's getting up at 6 a.m. and having breakfast, ideally within an hour of waking up, then it's quite likely you're going to need a morning tea, and then lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, and if you want an evening snack or dessert. Okay, so that was the first point, and probably the longest point. The second is you're much better to focus on what to add in rather than what to take away. Now, this one is kind of self-explanatory, but the reason why I add this in is because I have seen too many people who come to me after doing elimination diet after elimination diet, or restricting so many good foods, restricting things like dairy, gluten, soy, eggs, nightshades, histamines. Oh my gosh, the list goes on. And look, don't get me wrong, I do think there can be a time and a place for looking at food intolerances, but this really has to be individualized. And I want to be sure that we're prioritizing someone's relationship with food in the process. So if in doubt, focus on what you can add in rather than what you subtract. Because what is safe for everyone to do right now is looking at adding in wonderful foods that support the body. No matter where you are, you can start with, after you make sure you're eating regularly and enough, obviously, you can start with adding in. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about things like nourishing fats, like nuts, seeds, olive oil, and avocado. Things like omega-3s, like oily fish, seafood, soy, walnuts, chia seeds, and flax seeds. Lots of colour and antioxidants, so things like berries, citrus, pretty much all fruit and veggies. Cocoa, including chocolate. Tea, like green tea. Herbs and spices like turmeric, rosemary, sage, and thyme. I could go on, but like I said, there's so many good podcasts that talk about anti-inflammatory eating for endo. Just if there is stuff around subtracting foods from your diet, you can hold off on following that, because that's so much better to be individualized, if at all. So focusing on what you can add in and not take away. Examples of doing this is just asking yourself the question, where can I add? So for example, you might sprinkle seeds on your salad or your cereal, or aim to have 3 different colours of veggies at each meal. Or lunch and dinner, not necessarily breakfast. Having fruit. So if you are having fruit, maybe thinking, where can I add? Maybe you can add in yogurt or chocolate or peanut butter or cinnamon. So that's number 2. Number 3, what I think is also missing from the conversation is when we're talking about the difference between going gluten-free and low gluten, and why also you should get tested for celiac disease before doing either. Now, why I want to talk about this is because gluten is one of the hottest topics in endo's faces. And there is a reason. There is some research on gluten-free for endo. And I guess it's also a hot topic in any space where immune-related conditions are involved, really. But the conversation usually goes like this. Gluten is bad for immune-related conditions. Cut it out. And that's pretty much how it goes. And my heart just sinks as, because I can just imagine people being deprived of things like croissants and, normal sourdough and these kinds of foods that contain gluten, perhaps unnecessarily. So I wanted to add a little bit more to that conversation rather than, avoid. So there's so much I could go into about gluten and things like the difference between gluten and fructans, or gluten and amylase trypsin inhibitors, or ATIs, but I go through all of that in the course, and this podcast would just end up being way too long and complicated. So what I do want to add to the conversation is a few points. Number 1, you do not have to go gluten-free to improve your endometriosis symptoms, period. It's not essential. And also, I don't recommend it if you experience any disordered eating either. Second, there is research that supports gluten-free for endo symptom improvement, like I said before. So it is an option. And if it was going to work for someone, most people would see an improvement within 2 to 4 weeks. Like I said, it's unclear whether it's down to gluten or fructans or ATIs or a combination, but there is definitely some research that shows improvement. Thirdly, please get tested for celiac disease before you go cutting out any gluten. People with endo have a higher chance of having celiac disease. It is still unlikely, but you need to be eating gluten before having the celiac serology or a celiac screening blood test done to make sure that it's accurate. Otherwise, if you're taking out the gluten, then you might get a false negative. So please, please, please ask your doctor for that blood test prior to cutting out gluten. And then lastly, now this is just based on my experience, but I find that if you do decide to go gluten-free, I find that actually going low gluten can be just as helpful for some people. Now, this may look like avoiding gluten-containing foods in really large amounts, and things like pasta, for instance. But maybe you could, keep gluten-containing foods to once a day. So rather than having toast or wrap and pasta, it might just look like having it at one point in time. Or it might look like eating low gluten at home, but not worrying about it so much when you're traveling or eating out. It might also look like noticing that some foods you're absolutely fine with, like maybe you don't find you have an issue with sourdough or wraps, but others not so much. So maybe things like wheat noodles or pasta, for instance. So what I find is that when we do low gluten, it allows a lot more flexibility in our nutrition and in our choices. And that flexibility can help us to minimize some of the negative impacts that can happen when we go entirely gluten-free. Things like negative impacts socially and to our mental health. So that's my third point. Now, my last point, number 4, is somewhat related, and that is that nutrition changes might not have to be forever. When people recommend making a nutritional change, whether it be something like cutting out gluten or adding a supplement or food, please know that this may not have to be forever. Bodies are such dynamic places. They're really dynamic systems. They're always changing. And I love the fact that the cells in our gut even turn over every 2 to 4 weeks. They're one of the cells that turns over the most often. And that's really, really cool. So as long as you don't have an allergy or a condition that warrants the complete elimination of a food like celiac disease, don't believe anyone that says you have to cut out a food or add in a food entirely forever, because what you might find is that with time and with support and with things like surgery or other modalities, or even a change in environment like moving to a different climate or moving out of a house that has mold, what you might find is that your body will respond to foods differently as time goes on, right? As these things evolve. And so that is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about supporting people to tune into their own bodies rather than relying what I or what other people say is gospel, because your body is going to give you the best feedback about when might be time to, bring back in a food or change a food or remove a food, whatever. But know that these things are really dynamic. Okay, there you have it. That's 4 key things I wanted to add to the conversation about nutrition for endo. I hope you found something helpful in there. If you have a friend or a loved one with endo who is sick of all the confusing and restrictive nutrition info, then please send them this episode. If you have any thoughts or questions, hit me up over on Instagram at Nadia Maxwell Nutrition. Or if you want to know more about the course, I've got plenty of info on my website, nadiamaxwell.com. Otherwise, Instagram is where you'll find me. Thank you so much for listening to Good Enough Nutrition. If you have thoughts or questions from today's episode, hit me up over on my Instagram at Nadia Maxwell Nutrition. If you have a moment to rate or review the podcast, that would be amazing. Or share that you're listening on your stories and tag me. I absolutely love to see it. As always, remember that guilt has no place near our food or bodies, and you are good enough as you are always.